Thank you, Ray Addison. For news headlines that are dominated by Israel and Gaza, and hundreds of lawyers signed a letter to the government this week alleging that Britain is violating international law by delivering weapons to Israel. The letter claimed that the ruling of the International Court of Justice found a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza, where it says conditions are catastrophic. The letter went on to say that Britain has a legal obligation to prevent any such genocide. I'm joined by Natasha Hausdorff, Legal Director of UK Lawyers for Israel. Welcome back to GB News. Using the law in this conflict is very important. We sometimes call it lawfare. And I would say that this letter has had quite a big impact, with a lot of people taking it at face value, that what it says about Israel being in breach, about the possibility of genocide and so on, that this is all established. But you argue with some of that, don't you?
Well, I would say that it's perhaps using and abusing the law, and this letter has now also been the subject of a response sent also last week to the Prime Minister, signed by now over 1,000 lawyers, including former members of the Supreme Court, as well as the Justice Minister, former Justice Minister, Lord Wolfson, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, Lord MacDonald. There are very senior lawyers indeed that have signed on to this, a letter calling out not just the serious error and misstatement of law that was set forth in that original erroneous letter, which you've referenced, but also, unfortunately, calling out the basis upon which the supposed legal assessment was made, which is a false basis. It's quoting Hamas statistics in terms of casualty figures. And so this combination of false facts and false law, coupled with really problematic legal analysis, has clearly shifted the debate and is the subject, I'm afraid, of serious misinformation. It's a situation in which the public are being misinformed.
A lot hangs on this. We heard Tobias Ellwood a moment ago in that clip saying that Britain would need to move into line with international law, that this would end up with Britain, etc., probably, not supplying arms to Israel. So a lot hangs on it. So let's begin with, what is it that has been misunderstood about what the International Court of Justice has said?
Well, the clear error that this letter was predicated on was a misstatement that the International Court of Justice held in January in its provisional order, that Israel well, some have called it plausibly guilty of genocide. What the letter, in fact, referred to was a seemingly invented term of plausible risk. Now, that doesn't feature in the judgment at all. And the day after this letter was released, the preeminent legal journalist Joshua Rosenberg pointed out this error and, in fact, clarified for all of those 600 signatories that the court had, in fact, considered the plausibility that the right South Africa was claiming in its application to the International Court of Justice, the plausibility that those rights fell within the Genocide Convention. It's a remarkably low threshold, but it is important and a significant distinction, what may sound like a technical one, because it puts the lie to this suggestion that Israel has in any way, even plausibly, been found guilty of genocide, or that there is, in fact, a plausible risk that has been established. And that is, unfortunately, the false basis upon which all of the discussions we've seen over the last few days about arms embargoes have been predicated. And clearly it's causing serious damage because we've got a series of civil servants who are voicing their concerns. But principally, the critical issue here is that Hamas is drawing succour from the manner in which this discussion has shifted. They've already rejected offers of a ceasefire that the Americans have endorsed. And what we see is that this very dangerous position that is being advanced is working to Hamas's favour. It is prolonging the conflict, because all that Hamas have to do in order to succeed, in order for them to be victorious in their eyes, is survive. And these calls for an immediate ceasefire off the back of this misinformation are serving Hamas's purpose, prolonging this conflict and ultimately costing lives on both sides.
Let us deal with another legal issue, which is the issue of applicability. I mean, is the judgment, whatever it is, applicable to Britain?
This is the ICJ provisional measures.
I beg your pardon, yes.
Well, it's not a judgment in the sense of there's been no ruling on the merits, but critically, this is a case between South Africa and the United Kingdom, and any Forgive me, I'm so sorry, between South Africa and Israel. Your question is to do with the United Kingdom. So any decision ultimately by the court will be binding on the parties to the case. That's another misstatement of international law to suggest that the UK would be bound by those specific findings. However, the United Kingdom is a party to the Genocide Convention, as of course is Israel. And that is the legal hook that has been used. If you ask me, the allegations of genocide are so palpably unfounded. It is a blood libel that has been advanced, but it has been done so for particular legal reasons, and that is because it serves as a hook, both for Israel, but also ultimately for the United Kingdom and other signatories to the Genocide Convention.
So the counter letter, which is signed by 1,000 lawyers, which you've mentioned today...
And counting.
And counting, more people adding their names. I dare say they might be to the first letter as well. So that deals with these arguments, yes?
It points out the error that the first letter was based on. It's a much shorter letter than would be required to counter absolutely every element of the first one. There is more rebuttal forthcoming.
Now, are numbers of people being killed relevant? Obviously, there is a dispute between the Ministry of Health, which is Hamas-controlled, which produces one set of figures, other figures which are circulating. However, is it denied that large numbers of civilians are losing their lives, including lots of children?
Well, I think the difficulty with that is defining large numbers. What is clear is even on these unsubstantiated, and many have called them out as false numbers that Hamas has been putting out, they're internally inconsistent. And the manner in which they have gone up on a daily basis is a real cause of alarm in terms of the consistency. And there's an awful lot of open source analysis, which in fact the letter footnotes. This is the response letter, which is important for people to realise. But quite aside from that, even if we were going to go according to the Hamas figures themselves, taking into account the fact that Israel knows that it has killed at least 13,000 terrorists, which are not accounted for in those figures at all. There's no distinction between terrorists and civilians that Hamas puts out. They fail to...
Do you know how Israel knows that it's killed 13,000?
So on the basis of intelligence, the numbers could in fact be far higher than that, but because Israel is democratic and accountable, it only puts out information it is 100% sure of. There is an intelligence basis of the individuals that they have identified that are killed that have links either with Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or other terrorist organisations operating in the Gaza Strip, trying to target Israelis on a daily basis. So those numbers we can, in fact, trust. They are the subject of accountability and, indeed, applications by NGOs on a regular basis to the courts in Israel. So if we compare the numbers that we know that of terrorists that have been killed and also take into account the fact that we don't know how the people that Hamas are claiming have been killed. What we do know is that Hamas have been killing their own civilians. They've been shooting them, bombing them. Even the Americans have established that this is the case, as well as, of course, committing this grave war crime of using civilians as human shields in order to drive up the civilian casualty figures. Taking into account all of that, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu assessed on the basis of the information he has, that the Israeli government has, that they are looking at it as a civilian to combatant casualty ratio of 1 to 1. That is unheard of in armed conflict, not to speak of the kind of armed conflict that Israel is involved in the intensely populated Gaza Strip, where Hamas has spent 16 years embedding its terror infrastructure in civilian neighbourhoods. When we compare that to the global average put out by the United Nations, which is 9 to 1, it's incomparable, and it's unprecedented, the measures that Israel has been taking to protect civilian life. It couldn't be further from the claims of that utterly misguided letter last week.
Quite briefly, can we move from the legal arguments to the political? And I would put it to you that Hamas, that 6 months ago today, launched a savage attack on Israel, murdering and raping and taking hostages, has today achieved amazing political objectives. That is to say that the democracies of the world, which are supposed to be the natural allies of the democracy, Israel, one by one are reducing their enthusiasm or peeling away or thinking about withdrawing their support. And is not Hamas delighted with this result?
Oh, of course, this has been its objective for the last 6 months. That's why it deploys these appalling tactics, and it uses its breaches of international humanitarian law to its advantage. I mentioned earlier that Hamas's only hope here is to survive. That's why there have been calls for Israel to be prevented from going into Rafah and ending this war with Hamas being destroyed and the hostages being returned. Let's, of course, not lose sight of the 134 hostages that remain within the Gaza Strip. I know that the Foreign Secretary has today again called for the hostages to be returned, but linking that with calls for an immediate ceasefire before the hostages are returned and Hamas is defeated is serving Hamas's purposes here, and it is encouraging them. And that is critical not just in respect of Israel, because Hamas is an Iranian proxy, just like Hezbollah, that continues to fire on Israel in the north of the country. And these proxies don't intend to end their battle against the West with Israel. Israel is fighting the West's war here, and these calls are doing untold damage to that much broader objective also.
Very clear. Thank you very much, Natasha Hausdorff.